Right, so it looks like people are slowly trickling in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second presentation in our series, Latinos in STEM, a career path series. Right now, we're just showing you a slideshow, just some information about the seminar series, LOGRAS, the Latino Organization of Graduate Students, our presenter, Dr. Patricia Hernandez from Sandia National Labs. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes for people to trickle in, and I think like in a minute or two I'll introduce Patricia, and then we'll get going with the presentation. All right, I think I'm gonna start. So welcome everyone, it's good to see you all here to our second Latinos in STEM presentation, career path series. So today I have the honor of presenting Dr. Patricia Hernandez from Sandia National Labs. She's an engineer and systems analyst within the Systems Research and Analysis Group at Livermore, California site. That's Sandia National Labs. She's worked on a broad range of national security issues, including emergency response and chemical and biology security, using risk and prioritization methodologies. Her work has also extended into the operational practice of the space, such as when she briefly served as the lab coordinator of the Rotoma Ebola Diagnostic Center in Conakry, Guinea. She's also been recognized with the Department of Energy Secretary Appreciation Award and was also selected by Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security to participate in the Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Initiative Fellowship in 2017. She actually has a BSE in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan, and she attended Georgia Tech, where she received her master's degree in mechanical engineering and then a PhD in bioengineering. Her graduate work focused on biomaterials and modulating the humoral immune response, specifically in response to the tuberculosis vaccine. She's interested in the effects of advancing biotechnology and the resulting ease of use and access on biosecurity. So she's been doing a lot of really interesting work at Sandia National Labs, especially now with COVID. You could see that biosecurity is extremely relevant. I want to encourage everyone to leave questions in the chat throughout the talk. At the end of her presentation, I will be reading the questions, so she'll be taking questions at the end. And without further ado, Patricia, I'll let you go ahead and start your talk.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Monica. Let's see, and I'm just going to go ahead now and share my screen. So yeah, I'm very honored and excited to sort of be able to speak with everyone here today. When I heard about, this series, I thought it was just so great to not only be exposed to the breadth of different options that is available in terms of career paths, but I really did also like the angle of, what is it like for, Hispanics and Latinos to be, serving in these different spaces, and what do those experiences look like? So what I'm going to go through in my talk today is a little bit about Sandia generally, because I do think the national laboratories are a really great option to pursue work in government and national security. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the more specific things that I've done and how I think my experiences and my identity have really helped shape me and contributed to the type of work that I do. Like Juanita said, I love questions, so I'm really excited to be answering questions at the end, and so I'm really looking forward to this as a dialogue. So to get started, what is Sandia? So Sandia National Laboratories is really a national security laboratory, where our mission is to develop these advanced technologies to ensure global peace. And now sometimes that can sound somewhat cliche, but really at Sandia, and really I think this applies to work generally within national security and government, you really do have the opportunity to do work that does contribute to something more. And really at Sandia, the way we pursue this is to really this idea of how can we render exceptional service in the national interest. So, I said that Sandia is a national laboratory. What are the national labs? So what you have here is on the map of the U.S., are different locations where Department of Energy laboratories are. You might also hear things such as like FFRDC, which stands for Federal Research and Development Center. So these are laboratories that you can see are quite spread across the countries, across the country. And so they represent a variety of different mission spaces, and the ones in such as in yellow are primarily science laboratories, such as Pacific Northwest National Labs or Argonne National Laboratory. In red, you see the labs that fall under what is known as the National Nuclear Security Administration. And so that's a subset under the Department of Energy. One thing to also point out is that these are just Department of Energy laboratories. They're actually quite a broader set of FFRDCs and labs that do work contributing to national security, such as MIT Lincoln Laboratory, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. So there are lots of different opportunities to sort of pursue work in this space. But like I said, the red dots have to do with these NNSA laboratories, of which Sandia is a part of. And you'll see that Sandia is sort of located in two specific locations, and it goes back to our mission as a systems engineering laboratory, where we were really the integrators to support the physics laboratories. The physics laboratories were Los Alamos National Laboratory and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. So Los Alamos is in New Mexico. That's why you see one location in New Mexico. And then Lawrence Livermore is in Livermore, California, which is just outside of San Francisco. And so where I am actually located, and so we're just right across the street from them. So, and so that really gets sort of to the history of our two programs themselves. And so, it's easy to talk about these national laboratories in the abstract. But one thing I think is important to keep in mind, and I'll touch on this a little bit more, is that when it comes to like our impact itself, this is something that can really be, felt, I think, by a lot of folks. So as Marisa said, we've been very active in the COVID-19 pandemic response, and I can speak a little bit more to that. I always have to say I apologize to those of you, especially grad students, who work in the clean room and spend hours and hours in there because we invented it. And so this is an example of where we saw a gap, and we created the facilities and technology needed to satisfy that. So let's see. And I always like to include this slide in here because one, this idea about where does Sandia's funding come from? Because one, it gives you a sense of scale. Our funding is our budget is about $3.8 billion, quite a large endeavor. And it also gives you a sense of what type of work that we do. So a lot of it goes back to why we were founded to begin with, and that is the National Nuclear Security Administration. And so that goes back to a lot to our nuclear deterrent, which I'll speak to in a bit. But we also do quite a work more broadly for national security, and that's where the majority of that other half comes from. And so now I'm going to go through some more specific examples by highlighting some of the work that I've done as it relates to our different national security missions. But I realized one thing I forgot to do at the beginning. Marisa gave the great introduction for me based off of the bio that I provided, but I realized, in these official bios, we sometimes leave out parts of ourselves that really speak to a lot of our character. So yes, I went to the University of Michigan. I went to Georgia Tech, very proud of that. Where I'm from, though, originally, I think really built a lot of my character that enabled me to go forward and do these things. So I'm originally from South Texas, from, Mission, Texas, or McAllen, Texas. It used to be that a lot of people didn't know where that was, unfortunately, due to the migrant and refugee crisis there, the recent hurricane, and the fact that we're one of the hardest hit areas in Texas related to COVID. We've been in the news quite a bit. So, but that's where I'm from. It's an area that is majority Hispanic, majority of folks from Mexican descent, including myself. One thing I think folks look at me sometimes and they make assumptions. I actually do not speak Spanish, and that is because when I grew up, my father and my aunts and my uncles, a lot of folks from that generation, were very much discriminated against because of their background. And so they made the choice not to teach their children Spanish, because of that discrimination that they felt. Now, I think they also loved the fact that they could talk about the kids and the kids didn't know what was said about them. But I grew up not speaking Spanish. And so while I understand Spanish mostly sometimes, and I can pronounce things correctly, I actually don't speak it. Now, that said, I still grew up in an area that was and still is, heavily majority Hispanic. And so I grew up with that culture, that sense of, at least for me, was very much a sense of community, a sense of family importance, of, trying to do better for not just you, but for those as a whole. And so, my mother was a teacher, my father was in law enforcement, and I think that this idea of doing things that serve others was instilled in me very early, which honestly I think propelled me to consider work in government and work in national security, even when I was an undergraduate. So, this idea of doing work that has a higher purpose and can really sort of contribute broadly to society was something that for me, work in national security was a good outlet to do. So what has that work looked like? Well, at Sandia, one of the things that we do is a lot of work in global security. And so this idea that it's not just about, creating security internal into the U.S., but, goes back to that global piece. This idea if we can create security more broadly, it helps us as a whole. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to work quite a bit in this space. And again, mostly because it's called to me. I really like working in this space. So for example, during the West Africa Ebola crisis, I was able to deploy and act as a laboratory coordinator there. And so that was a really amazing experience because it allowed me to, sort of be on the front lines to try to help, not just in the response to the Ebola outbreak itself and making sure that we were running diagnostics, getting the numbers back to the WHO, the World Health Organization, but also trying to think beyond, the current situation and think about how can we best translate this capability to the host country, in this case Guinea, in a way that best worked well for them. So it wasn't just us, the U.S., saying this is how you should do it, but it's about building broader capabilities that works with them. I've also had the opportunity to attend the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva. And so that was very much a sort of a moment for me where, I'm this person from South Texas and suddenly I'm in Geneva at this, broad meeting with a variety of different diplomats. It's a very humbling moment, but it's also a moment where I think you can begin to be really proud of the work that you've done. And I think one, experience in particular was interesting for me. I had the opportunity to go teach a course in Veracruz, Mexico, on nuclear detection architectures. Now, my degrees are in biosecurity, not nuclear engineering, but one of my specialties is risk analysis. And so I was going as part of that course to teach about risk and how do we look at systems as a whole. And so, ironically, when they, asked me to go, I sort of had to check with them. I was like, you're not sending me because you think I speak Spanish, right? Because I don't, and that's not going to work well if that's an expectation. And they said, no. This is, because you're the best person for the job. And so that was a really great experience. One, because again, it is this opportunity to have a larger impact where you're talking to members from different countries about how can we better increase security and resiliency to try to prevent nuclear smuggling and proliferation. But also, it enabled me to, while I didn't speak the language, I was very familiar with what it's like to not speak the language. So when I'm giving my talk, for example, I'm very much aware of the differences and understanding that's required in terms of different cultures and languages. So, the interpreters even came up to me afterwards and they said, "Your pacing was so great. Thank you so much. I didn't use a lot of idioms. I had good pacing, all these things that sort of helped, not only in the content, but also make sure that it's sort of understood more broadly." So another core aspect of our mission is nuclear deterrence. And so nuclear deterrence is something that I think a lot of people don't always understand, because it isn't something that's always talked about in terms of what is our deterrence strategy? What does our nuclear weapon stockpile look like? That doesn't always come up in everyday conversation. But, it's one of those challenges that really speaks to something that's can sometimes be really intimidating, but it's something that, needs to be done and needs to be taken care of. We have to ensure the safety and security of the stockpile. And what I think is really interesting about this space, beyond the fact that you can almost think about it as a representation for a lot of things that sometimes happen, or research that is carried out in government that's not always apparent or initially transparent to a lay audience. It's also a field that is not only critically important, but really requires a diversity of thought and approaches to address it. So something that I commonly hear is, I can never work on a weapon system. I don't want to work for anything that has to do with a weapon. And I completely respect that. But those types of voices are exactly the types of folks we need working on these systems. Mostly because, if a primary goal is safety and security, that means you never want these weapons to potentially be, misused or used in a way they weren't intended to. So, we want the type of people who say, "I wish these things never existed and I would never want to touch them." Perfect. We need that type of viewpoint. And not only in this, but in a variety of other fields, it's where you need that diversity of thought and background to best lead to a better product or outcome as a whole. So we also at Sandia broadly work on national security programs, which you can think about this really supporting, for example, the Department of Defense. And this what I really want to highlight here is just the diversity of different programs that fall under this. So you can have everything from cybersecurity, chemical and biological defense, space systems, hypersonic vehicle design, all sorts of things fall under these types of national security programs. And really, because of this, we really need a diverse set of folks to address them. Again, my background is in biosecurity, and I have worked in a variety of these spaces. And one of the things you have to realize is that you are trained not only in your discipline, but you are trained, especially within the STEM field, to think critically within a space. And so your thoughts and your viewpoints do matter. And ultimately, they matter for a reason, right? I think one of the things I love about working within national security as a whole, and this includes not just these programs, but, with what we do at Sandia as a whole, is that it's really, again, for that mission. And I think that's why, especially within, the national labs, it's sort of considered this midway point between academia and industry. In industry, you absolutely have an application, you are driving for that. Typically, that is driven for a profit reason. So you have to sometimes compromise based off of that. In academia, you have a lot of flexibility, you have a lot of creativity, but sometimes, I think especially for graduate students, sometimes we even struggle with, well, how is this going to be used in the end? And what I think is nice in the national laboratories is that it's that combination of the two. You know, you are absolutely driving for an application in the end, right? It's for some national security application. But you still have a lot of that creativity and flexibility to really, expand your technical skill sets. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, especially given how things change in the environment. So, for example, I was out, speaking to a student group, a Latino student group at Stanford, shortly after the 2016 election. And I had a student ask me, they said, how can you, someone who is, Hispanic, work for this administration? And I had to say, look, for one, I don't work for this administration, right? I am, one, within the national labs, we're actually not technically considered government employees. But even if I was, I don't serve the president. I'm not working in the White House. I serve this mission, right? And this national security mission is sort of bigger and more continuing beyond specific presidencies. So, and to me, that's what drives me, knowing that what I'm doing is, having an impact that helps others, beyond sort of maybe what is happening, in politics in DC. So another area is more specifically around energy and homeland security. So that can mean everything from looking at alternative energy, looking at climate change impacts, and around homeland security. One of the projects I worked on in that space, since one of the aspects is protecting critical infrastructure, was working with FEMA and the National Hurricane Program. They were coming to us because they were trying to find a better way to do hurricane evacuation studies. And so, again, not technically within my area of expertise, from a education background, but again, it was this sort of big system type problem. And so, one of the reasons why I was really motivated was, again, had to do with my background and my experiences. I'm from Texas. Luckily, actually until just recently, we hadn't been hit by a hurricane in quite some time. But my dad, being in law enforcement, had to go out many times to prepare for various tropical storms and such like that. And my husband and his in-laws are all from Miami. And so they are very much impacted by hurricanes quite often. So this was, again, something that was also very personal for me, where I was personally motivated beyond my broader interests in national security. And what was interesting is that even in that project, opportunities came up that I didn't even, realize where my even more specific background applied. For example, reading an old hurricane evacuation study based in Texas, based actually where I was from, they talked about, and this is an older study, and so they talked about specific villages being impacted. And I was like, villages? That's a really old term that we don't use anymore to talk about it. And I happened to make the comment to my dad, and he goes, oh, well, you know what they're talking about. It's a translation. And I realized what they meant were colonias, which colonias in South Texas are basically unincorporated small settlements where people have built, their homes, but is not connected to anything. It's not connected to electricity or water typically. And so these are places that are very vulnerable in the case of a natural disaster, as well as, specific communication challenges in terms of how do you notify someone that an evacuation has been ordered. So, that was an opportunity for me to then go back to the team and say, look, it may look simple on paper, if you're just looking at traffic patterns and stuff like that, but you have to realize, this is the reality for this area. And not only is this just for, this area in South Texas, but if we're going to think about a system that's going to be rolled out to address everything from North Carolina to Miami to New York City, how do we create a system that's flexible to adapt to those different needs? So again, it was an opportunity for me to bring my background and experiences without me even realizing it when I joined the project, and to have that impact. And so finally, another core aspect for us is advanced science and technology. And this is really something that underpins everything that we do at the laboratory. And I think it's important, not only to highlight, the fundamental research that we do, but it's a good reminder, I think, for those of us in STEM of the skills that we have, and to recognize those skills. So, while, a variety of things that, like I said, I haven't, that I worked on, I haven't specifically used my degree. In other senses, I really have. And it's really, for example, that PhD, where I had to go from, honestly, not taking a biology class since high school and being very ME focused, to ending up that my research focused on something that was more fundamental immunology. That's not only the sort of, getting the PhD itself, but that, the things I learned along the way, and the way I had to adapt how I approach and solve problems along the way, was a really critical skill. And I think, it's one thing that we need to remind ourselves of, just give yourself credit for all the work that you do in this space, to be, especially if, within STEM. And, it's, again, this is, one of the things that you become, especially if you earn a PhD, you are considered an expert. And it's something that you sometimes really have to own, especially when you're in a meeting. The majority of participants are all significantly older than you. They all may belong to a ethnic background that is not yours, and they, let's say, maybe all of a different gender of yourself. You have to realize that you belong there, and you have to own it, and you have to be confident, and realize that things are still going to happen that you wish didn't. Someone is going to repeat exactly what you said, even though you just said it. Those things are going to happen. I wish they didn't, but this is where you being in that room is that first step, and then that wake that you create behind you can try to prevent and mitigate that in the future. Right. So, when I'm leading a team and, within a meeting, I make sure to acknowledge, if I'm following up on someone's idea, as so-and-so just said, I really like this and I think we should do this. Right. So giving that acknowledgement that you want to receive and being that example for others, I think is really important. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going to rest on that, our abilities and capabilities and our knowledge, that has to be a priority. I think especially in graduate school, it can be a struggle sometimes to, you want to give back, you want to keep being active, but you also have to realize that you can't be that example if you don't make it through, right? So again, sometimes I think and to be fair, this happens in undergraduate too. There's so many different, things going on. You want to give back, and that is great. You absolutely should, but you still need to, if you're going to be that example, you need to make it through. And it's okay, to say no, like I can't volunteer this time because I have this test or I have to get this paper in. That's okay, because ultimately, you making it through and advancing helps everyone else. And then you get to come back into these types of opportunities to hopefully, show folks that it's possible to get through. And that once you do get through, that there are a variety and amazing different opportunities out there for you. So with that, of course, I have to put this in here because I want you all to come work, because I think it's really a lot of fun what I've been able to do. So, I really hope that you consider Sandia. But with that, I'll sort of stop sharing, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. Again, I really like questions. If I was there in person, I'd be giving out all sorts of candy and stuff like that. So please feel free to ask away.
Can't hear you, Marissa.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, my mic was off. So I said thank you so much. It was a great talk, very inspiring. And I'm sure, especially you were where we are now that long. So proof that we can make it out of Georgia Tech with our degrees. So
And your
in the
sanity.
chat, sorry, what?
And your sanity. It's possible.
Yes. So I'm looking at the chat here. A lot of warm welcomes. Great talk. And it looks like our first question is from Danielle Ramirez. As Hispanic Latinos, what barriers did you face when looking at and applying to graduate programs?
Yeah. So honestly, I remember when I was even applying to graduate programs, I almost didn't consider Georgia Tech because of the recent, there are quite a few violent events sort of attacking Hispanics randomly. And then, shortly, I think either before or after, Alabama passed the law that said they could stop you at any point to ask for your passport to show, proof of citizenship. So I definitely considered, because one of the things, especially I think in grad school, this is a place especially where you're going to be living, for 4 to 6 years. So you really have to enjoy the location where you're going to. So that mattered to me. So I was a little nervous, honestly, about coming to the South, because I'm from South Texas. That is not the South. East Texas is the South. Like, South Texas is not the South. South Texas is Little Mexico. So, I was a little nervous about that. And I was nervous that folks would either, unconscious bias, they wouldn't want me, or they would want me to be part of their program for the wrong reason, right? That they would want me just because I'm Hispanic. I had my advisor ask that, could he call that out on a grant application, to sort of show that he was, serving minority students. And I just remember thinking, why does that matter? I'm not going to pour salsa on my cells or anything. So I think there's always that sort of back and forth. But I remember a grad student at Michigan at the time told me, he's like, my advisor has a different view on it. He in this case, the student's advisor loved to take Hispanic or other minority students because of how much more you typically had to do just to get to that point. And so if you think about all the barriers you might have experienced in undergraduate, or even just getting to that point, where your background and how you got there, and you still made it, and you're still a competitive candidate, you actually bring a lot more than you realize. And I think sometimes that's hard for us to admit, realizing that all of those challenging experiences that we might have had, whether, conscious or unconsciously executed by others on us. I remember I had a faculty member once say, he just loved pronouncing my name because it was such a wonderful language that his daughter was studying. And it was just, a thing that made me feel uncomfortable. And it's something that not all students have to go through. And you realize that all those things add up. So it's a little bit unfortunate about giving yourself credit for surviving those experiences, and realizing that those make a compelling case for why you can not only survive the challenges of grad school, but excel at them, because you've already done so much to get there, that you can very much succeed, getting your PhD or master's degree. So hopefully that answered your question, Danielle. If not, I'd be happy to speak to additional points.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of answering the question, especially about, trying to make sure that wherever you go to grad school, it's somewhere that you're very comfortable being, because although it's not a permanent life choice, it is a 5-6 year commitment, I'm going to say. Yeah, so definitely. So your next question looks like Raul Lopez. Hello, my major is cybersecurity, and I have found that many positions require citizenship in order for me to apply. Working in Sandia, a security laboratory, do you see space for non-citizens to work in a field like yours? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's always a challenging question. The reason why a lot of our positions require U.S. citizenship is because they require a security clearance to do the work, and because of that, you need U.S. citizenship in order to gain that security clearance. So that's a lot of the times where that comes from. Even when it comes to some of our internships, some of the work is not classified but considered sensitive. And so, again, there's citizenship limits particular to that, especially around things related to export control. Now, that said, there are definitely positions that do not require citizenship. And ironically, one of the things we've learned due to COVID, when all of a sudden, especially in California, we were one of the first, like I said, our locations, I'm in California, about 10% of our population is in California. The other 90% is in New Mexico. And so that means 1,500 people here in California, about 13,000 in New Mexico. So quite a bit different, but still, all of a sudden the California site was told to shelter in place due to the fact that the county that we're located in said, you shall shelter in place. So all of a sudden, we all found ourselves working from home, including quite a few of our cybersecurity folks. So, right now, I know that there are a lot, especially within cybersecurity, a lot of the positions do require security clearance. I think one of the things that we're hoping to learn as a laboratory from COVID is how do we best utilize the amazing talent that is out there? And given the fact that we can do quite a bit of our work from home, which means it does not require a clearance or potentially citizenship, can we do things to expand that pool? And so to be honest, I don't know what are the timelines for that. But I do know generally there are some opportunities, they tend to be smaller. But I am personally hoping that that's something we'll reevaluate as we move forward. I do know, for example, one of our postdocs that we recently hired, I think it's Adrian, from Georgia Tech last year. He's working in New Mexico, actually, and he's currently not a citizen. But it's also not uncommon for folks to earn their citizenship and become very successful. So one of our center directors, he talks about his experience quite a bit because he started off as a postdoc who did not have citizenship and then moved up. And so he's now very much been an advocate to be more inclusive of folks from different backgrounds.
Thank you so much. So our next question is from Will DeShazer. He's asking, how integrated are the San Francisco division with Los Alamos? How do your missions align and how do they differ?
So just to clarify, so like I said, Sandia has 2 locations, one in Albuquerque, New Mexico, one in out here in the Bay Area. So which is different from, and our location in New Mexico and Albuquerque is different than Los Alamos National Lab. But I'm assuming you're referring to just the 2 locations within Sandia itself. So please correct me if I'm wrong. So generally in California, it's a little bit of a microcosm of Sandia as a whole. So like I said, we're about 10%. And I will say in New Mexico, that's where we tend to have our bigger facilities. So I remember when I went there, I just remember hearing this huge boom and almost feeling like the ground was shaking and everyone else around me acted like they heard nothing. And I realized they're just so used to it. That's where we have these big rocket sleds that literally slam things into other things. So as we think about our nuclear deterrent and safety security, you want to make sure that things like a lightning bolt hit it, if things fell down on it, if it crashed, like that it wouldn't detonate if it's not supposed to. And for more information on that, I always recommend that folks go watch our YouTube documentary, Always Never, because it's just a fascinating illustration of the engineering challenges behind that. But so there are these huge rocket sleds that will like crash things into a wall and create these big booms, and that's just normal. But it's because in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they have all that space. In the Bay Area, we don't have space. So in California, we have more, that's actually where more of our biolabs are located. It's where a lot of our biofuels are located, our combustion research facility, a lot of our cybersecurity, a lot of our modeling, so things that don't take up as many facilities. We definitely still have labs in California, just not as many as they do in New Mexico. But generally, all missions are actually both covered between the sites.
Thank you. So looks like our next question is, Dile Hernandez, she says, "Hi Patricia, you mentioned how important it was for you to own your expertise, space, and voice in your fields and organizations. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on what specific things you do in order to assert yourself in environments that are not always as friendly to minorities and where other people's biases might be at play."
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I do is, one thing I think that honestly helps a bit is I always ask a lot of questions. So, whether it's a seminar, whether it was when I first joined my group, I tended to ask a lot of questions. And it sort of, I think, illustrates that you're actively listening, you're following along. And I think especially once you get into the practice of asking questions, you tend to ask better questions. And so it really sort of, I think it's also a way to honestly insert your opinion without it coming across as challenging of authority, right? So you can ask a question of like, well, have you considered, or I really like this, but how does this relate to this type of application? And I think there are always nicer ways to do that. There are definitely condescending ways to do that, which you want to avoid, but there are nicer ways to do that sort of illustrate your ability to process without coming across always as threatening. And but to be fair, that works for me. And I think you always have to find the style that works best for you. Because some folks just do not, because honestly, I've seen very effective people, not take an active voice in a meeting, but you know what, when they deliver materials, the materials are always flawless and they've built up their reputation that way. So for me personally, especially given the type of work that I do, where a lot of it tends to be very, very much like person-driven, very, interfacing with different sponsors, different operators. I realized I have to feel comfortable sort of talking and adapting. So another thing that I try to do is, speak to my audience. So, for example, when I was working on the hurricane program, a lot of that was working with local emergency managers, and these were mostly guys who were, not used to working, and one mostly older, and are very much like, a guy's guy sort of thing. And so luckily, my dad being in law enforcement, that didn't intimidate me as much, but I definitely knew that I had to adapt my speaking style. If I was going to explain to them a piece of software, I couldn't go about it the same way that I was talking to the software developer. And I had to be that intermediary and sort of translate between the two, which again, I think we, at least like in my experience, sort of having to be that sometimes, like having to sort of translate, how would I explain to my grandmother what I was doing, right? Versus how would I explain it to my father versus my friends versus my colleagues, and being able to speak in those different tiers and being able to adapt quickly, I think is another way that's really good it's a good skill to have. Because not only can you adapt to different technical spaces, but again, adapting to different audiences while still showing respect to that audience is something that's really, really important. And I will say also finding your champions. So one thing that has helped me, so for example, when one time literally a person said exactly the same example that I said in a meeting without even looking at me while he said it. I was so just shocked because it was so verbatim. I remember looking at my colleagues and then just like shaking their heads. So just even that acknowledgement was really encouraging, but also knowing that, afterwards, because it wasn't the place, unfortunately, to correct that person in the meeting. But the fact that they came to me afterwards and we're going to try to find a way to make sure that like you can speak up more and have a bigger role so that doesn't happen again. Like that's really important, I think, to have.
Thank you so much for talking about your experience in regards to that. It looks like, some more questions coming in. All right, so Jorge Breton has a question for you. He says, "I know you were very active on campus as a PhD student. Is there anything you would have done different? What suggestions do you have for current UT students?"
Yeah, so thanks, Jorge. So again, I would say remember your priority, honestly, as a student, right? Like your priority is to, if you want to be an example, you have to make it through. So really learning when to say no. So, for example, and to be fair, this is something I don't think I would have done differently. I feel guilty about it, but I would not have done it differently. When I was a student, LOGRAS had just submitted their charter. They were just getting off the ground. And I had come from being very active in SHIP, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers at Michigan. So I was really excited to know that there was an organization called LOGRAS and to be really involved with them. I signed up to be like a subcommittee lead related to outreach, really excited. I could tell that the other organizers, they were all new to this as well. And so we were all just doing the best that we could. I started to try to organize events, and I just wasn't getting any support from the broader leadership within LOGRAS. To where even my first event that I held, which was in partnership with a domestic violence shelter, specifically for Latinos, the only people who attended were my other first-year grad student friends, none of whom were Hispanic or Latino. So, after that, I just sort of realized, I was not in a place, just given how much I had going on, like getting used to grad school and understanding that, to be in that leadership position, to bring that organization up to where, I think it could have been. And that was hard because, this was, a community that I wanted, that I felt was important to me in undergrad, to really, surviving undergraduate and putting me in a good place as a graduate student. But I realized that was an organization that I couldn't spend the time to be a part of. And so, as Jorge knows, I still volunteered for various activities as they came available and stuff like that. I just realized I could not take that leadership position like I wanted to, and like I almost sort of felt like I should have done. But to be fair, so it's a little different, than your question, Jorge. It's, I don't think I would have done everything differently, but I think it's an important example to highlight. Because sometimes as much as you want to do as much as you can, and I applaud, the students who kept going at it, I realized it was just not the best, for me at the moment, and would not have put me in a position to be the best advocate for that community and for those types of events moving forward. And so I think it's sometimes like a hard decision. Again, we just have to acknowledge, because again, we have so many challenges going on. You really do have to sort of pick your battles.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience about that. I can definitely say, just being a part of the board of LOGRAS and other things, like you were saying, it can become very overwhelming very quickly. So, of course, it's like you have to find the happy balance between being involved, but not so involved that you might be overwhelming yourself with too many student activities. So I'm sure many of us can relate. More thank yous from everyone. Yeah, agreed. All your experiences have been great. So I was wondering, I guess we still have some time left, so I wanted to ask you another question. And I think you did touch some on about this in regards to, sometimes being maybe the only woman in the room, or, the only person of a diverse background. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how diverse the workforce actually is at Sandia, and are there initiatives going on right now to recruit new employees from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, so you can actually go and look at, I don't have the link in front of me, but if you search like Diversity Sandia, we actually do publicly publish the percentage of our workforce that's in broader workforce that's in R&D, workforce that's in management, senior leadership, for different ethnic groups as well as women. And it's not the best. Now, granted, in my group, and one of the reasons why I joined my group is when I went to interview, half of my interview panelists were women, and one of whom was a Hispanic woman, another recent manager was a sort of younger Black man. And so I was just really impressed at sort of the diversity, not only in the staff, but in the leadership. And so, and that really played a motivating factor in me going there. I had actually visited another FFRDC where when I interviewed, they were all of the same gender and the same ethnicity. Let me just put it that way. And they were all probably about 25 years older than me. So, and even the lunchroom was like that. And that's when that's one thing. It's like your group can be one thing, but like when you go to the lunchroom on site and you start to notice like everyone is like that, that was like a really big red flag. So I think, Sandia has definitely made it a priority. And I think we're trying to continue to get better, but I still think there's definitely progress like that needs to be made. I would say I think the California site is a bit better than New Mexico as a whole. But even then, so for example, it will show, I think, that we have 14% or so, or maybe even like 24% Hispanic technical staff in New Mexico, which sounds like a lot, and it is, it's great. Except when you realize that the state of New Mexico, where they're pulling from, is like 40%, 45% Hispanic, right? So you realize there's still a bit of a gap there. So, and then when you start to see the numbers decline as you go into leadership, I think that's what's really has some folks concerned. So, because I know one of the things that people commonly throw around is, oh, it's a pipeline issue. If only we had the starter sets, we'd be able to, promote up. And clearly what this shows is it's not a pipeline issue. I think that's been shown in other industries as well. But what I appreciate is that, I've always felt very comfortable speaking up when someone does say something inappropriate. And usually it's not from any sort of point of malice or anything like that. But what I appreciate is that that environment is there that encourages you to have those conversations and those dialogues to try to get everyone to a better place.
Of course, yeah, that makes sense, definitely. Just following up with that, so my other question was, I know that there's a lot of companies, so like in industry, where one of the things that they're trying to do in terms of, I guess, recruiting people from diverse backgrounds, specifically minorities, is they have these community groups, like they might have, so I don't know if they're kind of the equivalent of having like a grad student clubs or things like that. Does Sandia have those?
Yeah, we term them affinity groups. And so, yes, we do have those for a variety of different ethnic backgrounds, different identity backgrounds. I should just say a variety of different identity backgrounds. So whether that's LGBTQ or, just you're a parent or a military veteran or, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and I know that there are a variety of others that I'm missing. But that's, and they're both at the California and New Mexico site. So that's, I think, a really nice resource to know that is there as well.
Okay. Thank you. That's nice to know.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it looks like we don't have any more questions, but if there are any last tips or words of advice you'd like to give.
Well, here, I will totally put this in the chat. So I would say, so if you want to get looped into all the Sandia info, if you go to this link and register, it'll sort of add you to our mailing list to say like, thanks for attending and, here's a link to apply to jobs and things like that. Which, I have to, again, plug because I really enjoy Sandia. I think it's a great place to work. I've really, enjoyed it in my 5+ years. And I think one of the reasons why I've personally stayed, I always think that's a good question to ask. I think even in grad school, people say like, why did you go to grad school? And it's like, you should really be asking, why do I stay in grad school? Because I've definitely thought about leaving like every other month. So why have I stayed at Sandia? I've stayed at Sandia because I really enjoy the type of work that I do and the people that I work with. So, I really love that I'm surrounded by not only really brilliant people, but people who are excited to work together. And so I think that's so different sometimes than what you see in other industries and sometimes even in grad school. I mean, to be honest, I think I had a good experience in grad school in the terms of when I needed help, I could get it very easily from other grad students or professors. I know that's not the case for everybody. But, I was a little nervous coming into full-time position just because, I don't know what that environment's going to be like. And what I've loved is that everyone is really excited and really passionate about what they do. And so, and the fact that not only do I get to work with them, but I get to work in a variety of different areas. So I've worked quite a bit, mostly in biosecurity and biodefense. It's a field I really think is exciting. But I love the fact that I've also had the opportunity to work in everything from nuclear deterrence, policy issues, cybersecurity, biofuels, broader emergency management issues. And so that's just been a really amazing thing to do just because I like doing new things and I like that diversity. So, and again, yeah, I think back to the purpose of this talk, right, sort of your identity and what does this mean to work in this space. I think as a Latino working in government and national security, it can definitely be hard sometimes being the only person in the room who looks like you. But there are other times when you realize it honestly doesn't matter as much. So, when I go overseas, they don't look at me as a Hispanic. They look at me as an American, right? I'm representing the U.S. And so it's really honestly some of those times when you really realize your identity at that point is not necessarily so much about your ethnicity, but what has your background and such contributed to you being able to execute in the mission that you're working on. And a lot of the times I found my experiences growing up, and I think my culture and my family and everything that went around to forming me being me has really enabled and enhanced my ability to do that. So to me, I feel, while, sometimes it's hard being that only person in the room, I'm happy to have the experiences that I've had because it's made me that better person, I think, to do the mission.
Of course, yeah, definitely. So it looks like more thank yous, of course. You sharing your story was amazing, and I'm so glad that you can make it with us here today. I think we can stop recording. But thank you everyone for coming. Of course, please go and click Patricia's link if you're interested in, learning more about Sandia, job opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we're going to be in a variety of the career fairs coming up, so you can see me again later on if you like.
Perfect.
All right, well, thank you.